everybody. Good to be here, still in the Arctic Base Camp. I'm the only one dressed for the climate here, but I'm amazed that you are all looking good. We're starting off with our fourth session here, Exponential Roadmap Initiative sessions at the economy stage of impact at Arctic Base Camp in Davos. And I'm so pleased to have you, our panelist speakers, with us. Heather Johnson, Vice President, Sustainability and Corporate Responsibility from Ericsson, and Alexander Antonelli. And you have a lot of roles, professor at the University of Oxford in Gothenburg, and Director of Research at, sorry, I need to check, Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, among a lot of other roles. Very happy to have you here. And also Johan Falk, CEO of Exponential Roadmap Initiative. Happy to have you here. And our conversation is going to be a bit about how to race to the top and how can we continue with the transformation that we're in, but that we have been on a bumpy road a couple of years. And still have had a bumpy 2024 and maybe a bumpy 2025, start of 25. But also a lot of good things are happening. So I'm going to start with letting you introduce yourselves and also what you've done so far, with Heather starting. Tell us about what you do and the journey that Ericsson is and what you have achieved so far.
Okay, gosh. Well, I'll give
it a shot. And take it in small steps if you like.
I'll give it a shot. Thanks so much, Katarina. And it's just a pleasure to be here and in such good company. It's I'm working at Ericsson, a telecom network provider, and the mobile industry is one of, I would say, scale and ecosystems. I mean, it is really an amazing industry, and it is an industry, in fact, that is very forward-leaning when it comes to climate action, and especially on really setting ambitious net zero targets. So if I'll maybe start there. There's plenty to talk about, but if I start there, and I think that serves us quite well, because of course net zero is really about that whole ecosystem approach, and so both at Ericsson, as well as our customers, we are really working together to and have a very collective commitment to achieving net zero. I would say most ambitious 2040. That's when we have set it. But we're working with partners from 2040 to 2050. It's interesting. We're here in Davos, having the chance to meet so many, also even sort of broader ecosystem partners. And I have to say, there can be a lot of thoughts about Davos and opinions, but it is actually a place where you do tend to meet the coalition of the willing, and I think that coalition of the willing is also a coalition that is seeing the kind of coherent and comprehensive business value of driving net zero, and I think that is really important. So it isn't sort of just a do good versus a do business, but it is really this kind of convergence of it that is essential, I think, for really scaling the positive impact. So I think maybe I'll start. That'll be my first step, and happy to continue later.
Thank you so much. I'll jump over on the business note to Johan. Can you tell more about the business role in accelerating the transformation to a sustainable economy, and also what you picked up so far here in Davos?
Yes. Of course, the reality is that because the starting point of the Exponential Roadmap Initiative, where Ericsson was a really early partner, the first was the carbon law. We need to halve emissions every decade. The first halving by 2030 to be able to keep within 1.5. Now we know we're overshooting. We need to limit that overshoot to come back to safe operating space. We know that from Johan Rockström. Yeah. So we are about 5 years after the curve that we expect to follow. The same goes with nature, of course. There is also a a sort of nature carbon law as well, where we need to come down to 0 by 2030. We're not following that either. But we might be leveling out now, basically. We see so much acceleration in terms of the renewable energy acceleration, the vehicles and the switch, so it might be so that the curve is bending, which is a tremendous opportunity. I do see that the opportunity is actually when we actually shift from just focusing on the down curves to the up curves, because business is really motivated by the up curves, because one challenge has been that we're not scaling up the solutions, shifting out fossil sufficiently fast. So we need to really work on remove all these blockers so we can actually shift and drive the solutions much faster and get the critical mass now of companies, the wheeling companies in the front line, driving transition plans, and then also connect that to nations in the front line who see this as an opportunity to actually win the new economy. And in that way, we can create that positive, what we call race to the top, between nations and companies. So this will become an integrated part of the economy. And we could be reasonably close to that moment, in my opinion.
Thank you. Alexander, you're a scientist and you've been part of shaping the global nature and biodiversity agenda. Can you tell us a bit more about that? Because there were also some highlights last year on the COP in Colombia.
Thank you. Yes, Katarina, really great to be here and talk about this topic. And that's my first World Economic Forum in Davos. It's an incredible event. And as you're saying, Heather, people coming from different sides of society and, really this hope about turning the curve on nature, so the biodiversity loss we've seen, and that it's actually possible to really go towards a more positive future. And as you said, Katarina, we had a really interesting year last year. I've been part of the COP meetings on biodiversity, so that's the United Nations Summit meetings on biodiversity, which is really trying to target what can we do up to 2030 and then 2050. So the Global Biodiversity Framework is, in my opinion, the most important document we have. It is really the turning point in our society's development, because if we don't manage to turn that curve now, there won't be any species left of the most threatened species. So in a sense, I think that what we're seeing here is a mobilization that goes across all areas of society. It's about corporates, it's about scientists, it's about all stakeholders from the individual to the highest political levels, and trying to find those mechanisms to enable that change. So in my role as a scientist, I really see those global trends, but also see the challenge on the ground. So the organization I work at, the Royal Botanical Gardens Kew, we're working more than 100 countries, and a lot of people are still struggling to get the most basic funding to really enable transformation, like conservation, restoration, protection of the most endangered species. So I think it's not only that there's a big funding gap around the world, but it's also a gap of where the decisions are made down to the people on the ground trying to make it happen.
Can I do a follow-up on the biodiversity in nature? Because we can see lots of businesses are adopting and trying to set targets on biodiversity in nature, but there's still some struggling. Why is it harder for businesses or other actors to understand biodiversity in nature, or why is that? Or do you have any any illustration, or yeah, we'll start with you and then we go.
Okay, with my perspective?
Yes.
Yeah, so
yes.
I can't speak on behalf of corporates, but I do notice very often when I talk to people outside academia that biodiversity is still a bit of a diffuse concept. Even climate, people think it's all about temperatures, which is not, of course. It's about precipitation, change over a year, and so it's the same with biodiversity. It's about species, but it's about the genetic diversity. It's about the abundance of species, bioabundance, and in fact, there are more than 500 different ways of measuring biodiversity. But that's not a problem. It's no, it's not about saying it's too complex, too complicated. We don't want to deal with it. There are some really good ways of doing that, and it's about understanding that biodiversity is really about measuring the state of nature, and of course it's about understanding what species are doing in ecosystems, but also what kind of benefits we can derive from it. Now we're seeing this big movement in the global south to use biodiversity sustainably. It's not only about protecting, fencing off. It's about human interactions that need to be much more sustainable, and there are ways companies can engage with biodiversity, and that's what we've been trying to do, for instance, through the development of a framework for biodiversity credits. perhaps we can discuss this a bit later today as well.
Thank you, thank you. And Heather, going back to you, looking at your broad agenda, you're working both with your supply chains and also pushing policy. How do you do that?
Yeah, exactly. And I think, going back to that ecosystem approach, and, I started with customers because we're very customer focused, and really that business success is so intertwined with them. But you're absolutely right, Katarina, that, working with our suppliers and really, we have had in order to reach this net zero target, we have also been setting, 5-year incremental targets so that we will, by 2030, have reduced our supply chain as well as portfolio and use emissions by 50% and be net zero in our own operations by then. And so to do that really requires very meaningful action and cooperation and collaboration. But I think I think those mechanisms are in place. I'm not saying it's easy, but I think we understand what to do. We've identified, some of the hotspots, some of the areas to really tackle and put focus on. And as I said, too, we can even look broadly at, how even outside of our industry, are there other sort of entities or sectors where we can even, garner more collective action. But I think on the policy side, I think that is one area where we continue to, I think, sort of have push and pull. I think certainly this week has been very interesting with the change of, new president in the U.S. and some dramatic changes within the last 24 hours in that market. But then you have the EU and a new commission coming in, and really just how to navigate the geopolitics and the I would say the shifting landscape, I think is actually something that is really becoming essential when we're talking about some of the sustainability challenges. It will absolutely, public-private partnership is easy to say and extremely hard to do, but to really have these common efforts for, decarbonizing the grids in different markets across the world. This is, I think, the collective action that we need to take to succeed.
Thank you. Johan, you look.
Yeah, I think that is so important, Heather. It's and what's sort of been highlighted the last couple of months, that business is really ahead in terms of transforming their value chains, but these transition plans will not be possible to fully implement unless we have sufficiently strong policy frameworks in nations, both on the supply side and the demand side. It could be access to renewable energy, regulation regarding circularity, but actually encouraging demand and take-up of the new solutions. So it's incredibly important. So there are a number of activities now through all our networks to actually make that connection, because it's so important that the business show that these solutions are they are happening. It is achievable, but not at least showing the economical opportunity for countries, but also for them to reach their NDCs, their nationally determined targets, but maybe even more important to see it as an economical opportunity for them. And then just to link to what we said on climate and nature, I think there is a strong opportunity, something we looked in our framework as well, to create like integrated key performance indicators. So if you really drive hard towards circularity, it's really driving both climate and nature in a positive direction. So you don't need to be able to measure everything before taking action to transforming your value chain and service. We need more companies to start to take action, which is both positive for climate and nature, in my opinion.
Thank you. And Alexander, you're looking at biodiversity credits. So far, it's been also a bumpy market. So can you tell me about your work there and what you see, what the lookout is?
Yeah, so sure. As Johan says, nature and climate go hand in hand. They're different challenges, but they're very interlinked. So over the last 1.5 years or so, I've been part of the International Advisory Panel on Biodiversity Credits, which is a group of about 25 plus 100 people involved from different sectors of society, including indigenous representatives from all across the world. And we published a framework for high integrity credits together with the World Economic Forum and Biodiversity Credits Alliance at the COP16 meeting, the Biodiversity Summit in Colombia in October. And we also summarized the findings in a paper in Nature. And the idea here is that, so far we've concentrated very much on one funding mechanism for supporting restoration projects, which is essentially carbon credits. And there are some really good stories, but also some real challenge that we've all have seen. Biodiversity credits has as the purpose to restore and conserve nature. It's one funding mechanism. It's not the only one, but it's one that, if regulated, could get up to about $70 billion per year. That's one of the early estimates, which are, that's something to discuss. But the idea here is that companies would be able to buy biodiversity credits, which directly support those projects on the ground through different mechanisms. The first one is what we call compensation. So just as Heather was saying, when we've gone through the mitigation hierarchy, you do everything you possibly can and really demonstrate you've done it. The residual environmental impact you have on biodiversity could be compensated in a like-for-like, restoration, for instance, of the ecosystem you affect. And it cannot be cross-border, it needs to be there. The second mechanism is what we call insetting. So the first one is offsetting. The second one is insetting, which is directly linked to the supply chains of companies. In things like, if you're a beer company, you may need water for your products. And how do we ensure that the ecosystems around your supply chains can really provide you and make those products more resilient? And the third one is what we call contribution. It is not something you should, in your annual report, say that you're compensated. It's a net contribution because you as a company identify the role that your company can play in tackling the global biodiversity crisis. Of course, you can use that in your reports to brag about all the green profile you have. And we believe, and that's what we're hearing from many stakeholders, that this is a very interesting route because it's also about enabling companies, for instance, in the Global South, to receive funds from the Global North. Because systematically, we've seen a degradation of nature for hundreds of years, and it's also a way of cash flow that we need to see in order for the global biodiversity framework to happen.
Thank you so much. And speed and scale we're talking about, and we're actually getting closer to finalize this conversation. So I'd like to ask you, what do you wish for 2025? Given this current situation, what could you hope for?
There's lots. I'll take one. I think it is about I think concretizing the steps to take with the different partners. I think we now understand there's more of a maturation around what needs to happen, what steps need to be taken, and truly to galvanize the collective action, but with a very, it has to be relevant and make sense for every party to do this. And I think that maybe we can learn from some of the mistakes that we have made in the past of going too far in, if I say sort of this is just to do good. Well, it of course has a very positive impact on society, but it is good in a very more of a resilience, I guess, perspective and a long-term sustainable future. And I think to be able to concretize that to what does that mean for governments? What does that mean for corporations? What does that mean for civil society? I think that is something that I hope we start to really articulate and really that narrative comes forward so that it is really about the collective value that all of this delivers.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to COP30, so the climate COP in Belém, in my home country, Brazil, in November, and on the run-up to that. So until then, we really need to see more and more announcements of big money on the table, basically. So, for instance, this morning we heard there was a release of a $1 billion package to enable conservation restoration. We need to see concrete examples of how funds are being allocated to achieve the targets and goals of the global biodiversity framework. So I'm very hopeful that the nature and biodiversity agenda, the climate and nature agendas will come together. We have unfortunately separated them for too long, and it is really time that companies understand that the environmental impact to the world is not only about carbon emissions, it's about what we do to biodiversity as well. And those things need to come together, and hopefully that will happen this year.
Thank you. And Johan, last.
Yeah, I think we should not get too distracted of things happening. We need to keep the course. We should double down. The leaders should work together, support each other, motivate each other from the front line. That's really super important. I think the more now we've talked about the transition plans, we should integrate climate and nature as part of core business plans. That will be a big movement. The same should happen over time in national economical plans. It should be part of GDP over time. And there could be examples at BLM of really positive development in terms of solutions scaling up. So the more positive examples we can see, and how we can create that link between companies and value chains and nations, how it's driving a positive development for countries, not only in terms of cutting carbon. Yeah, that will be effect of it, but it's actually winning and building the new economy. I think that is a really good way forward. But I think just move forward is really important right now, and be optimistic.
Thank you so much. Let's move forward. And thank you so much, Heather. Thank you so much, Alexander, for joining us in this conversation. A warm hand.